Hello and welcome back to the channel. I have been quiet for a while and not posted many videos. This is just because I've been quite busy at work and taking a bit of a holiday. But in this video I thought we'd talk about Russia, because I like talking about Russia quite a lot. Obviously they're an interesting subject right now. And part of that I was thinking, what is going to be the long game for Russia? So regardless of what the outcome is in Ukraine, whether they win the war or don't, to achieve limited objectives or negotiate a peace settlement with the Ukrainian government, whatever the outcome, there needs to be some kind of post-Ukraine type scenario for Russia. So imagine, as you will, that you are the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and you have to negotiate your way out of this. In fact, actually don't be like Lavrov, because he has been quite a dismal failure as a foreign minister. He seems to have achieved not much more than saying strange things and annoying countries that were actually trying to be neutral, like Israel, with his rather crass Jewish comment. So don't be like Lavrov. Lavrov is not any kind of role model. But imagine you are the Russian foreign minister, and the Ukraine situation is settled one way or another. What are you going to negotiate to help Russia move on? So for doing this, I thought let's use the PESTLE analysis to start with. For anyone not familiar with PESTLE, it is just an analysis tool, and where you just break it down into topic areas. I've listed them there here on this slide. So let's go through them and then talk through the particular topic areas. So let's start with political. What is the political situation for Russia externally and internally? Now, internally speaking, I can't say much for Russia. I simply do not have any insider knowledge. But what is clear is, politically speaking, they need to maintain stability, and they will do so by strong state suppression and propaganda. And Putin and his government seem to have succeeded in that respect. So, judging by poll numbers, which says that many Russians support the Ukrainian war, this would seem to indicate that, with the exception of a large minority, mainly of youngsters and intelligent people, who are strongly opposed to the war, but also strongly opposed to Putin more generally anyway, Russia, politically speaking, in terms of internal dynamics, appears to be relatively stable. Whether that continues into the long term, we shall see. But externally speaking, it would appear to be a very different story. Russia is politically massively isolated. We can see this in all the sanctions imposed by the West and various other aligned nations. We can also see this in the UN vote that voted by over 140 nations to condemn what Russia is doing. And so, simply put, Russia is very much at this point in time in an international political minority. Now, in the past, perhaps during the Soviet days, you might have said that perhaps Russia could have called upon aligned states, let's call them communist states. But Russia is not really a communist country anymore. And so that sort of alignment doesn't really exist anymore. The closest, perhaps, is the likes of China, maybe some other peripheral nations around the world, maybe in Latin America, maybe in South Asia, who knows. But even they are not what you might call politically strong or strongly aligned with Russia at the moment. Even China is not that politically aligned, which I'll cover more of that in a bit. Let's go into economic with the next subject. What can I say about Russia's economic outlook apart from they just look terrible? Right now, in the short term, Russia has sustained itself. It has enough industry, it has enough agriculture to be a sort of vaguely self-sufficient state, just not a particularly comfortably so one. So they can produce all the necessities that they need, albeit in a somewhat austere manner. But economically speaking, the way Russia grew was by exporting commodities. So that would be grain, that would be minerals, and that would be definitely oil and gas. And so right now, the economic benefits to Russia, particularly their exports, have been massively cut. And that's a direct result of the sanctions. And this is a very significant short-term shock, and it's going to continue to get worse for Russia. So I believe at this point there is some shortage in Russia, but nothing severe. That is because when it comes to things like economics, it's a bit like an oil tanker in the sea. It can get hold, for example, but it takes quite a few miles before a tanker can actually stop. So there's a certain element of momentum that keeps things going, and that's very much the Russian oil tanker right now. It has been massively holed under the waterline, but it still hasn't stopped yet. It is still just carrying on into its own steam. And at some point, things are going to get pretty bad. We'll see when. Let's go to social. In terms of the social situation in Russia, that is interesting. And it depends how you look at it. From the view of the fact that Russia has been cut off, that many of the young, intelligent people with skills, with the future workforce, if you like, are desperately leaving Russia, then on the face of it, things look exceedingly bad for Russia and Putin. And not perhaps in the short term, because, for example, opposition will have left the country, but in the medium to long term, there will be consequences of losing all those people. But certainly in the short term, and maybe even further down the line, that might actually be a net gain for an authoritarian government like Putin runs. Having all your opposition leave creates, ironically enough, more social stability. The fact that the Russian population is sort of culturally cut off from the rest of the world should be destabilizing, but in a very controlling regime like they have in Russia, it is actually the opposite. It's more stabilizing because they can control the information, they can control what people think and how they react to events. But of course what that means is there's no social growth, there's no mixing of cultures, there's no understanding people. Russia will become more insular as a result of what is going on, which, while in any other sensible measure is seen as a bad thing, for a totalitarian government like Putin, that is possibly seen as a good thing. Which moves me to the next interesting subject of technological, which ties into economic and political as well. Because this is one of the things that people need to understand about the way the world economy works these days. Russia is a big country. It can make many of the things that it needs. It can feed its population, as long as it doesn't make a complete mess of the job, and it can manufacture basic goods and essentials. So in that sense, Russia can, to a reasonable degree, be self-sustaining. But if you maintain that sort of status for too long, because you have no ability to trade, no ability to interact fully with the global stage. So what I mean by that is you can't join, joint scientific cooperation efforts. You can't buy the latest chips or the most modern, phone and things like that. What that means is that over time, your economy will fall further and further back. Your technological growth will fall further and further. What is happening in the rest of the world? Because you can see this even if you look at a superpower like America. America is a superpower not because they are the best at producing everything. America, despite what many Americans might perhaps believe, America is very good, or perhaps even the best, in many categories, perhaps more categories than any other nation, but they are not the best in absolutely everything. But quite crucially, America has full access, or as full an access as is possible, to the global market. And that means America can buy the best of everything if it wants to. that option has been denied to Russia. So Russia may be good in certain niche areas, they may even be exceptional in other niche areas, but they can never be the best in everything. And because of those limitations and because of sanctions, technologically speaking, they're going to fall further and further behind the longer this isolation, the longer these sanctions go on. And that is going to impact quite a broad spectrum of areas within Russia, political, economic and social. So what's the legal status for Russia, apart from just simply pariah state? Well, pariah state, really. That means that Russia has certain legal status. It is part of very many international conventions. It is part of the Security Council of the UN. But Russia is about to find itself in a very uncomfortable place where it has a whole bunch of political leaders that possibly can never leave Russia again. Because if they do, or if they go to the wrong country, they could be arrested, deported, and face criminal prosecution in the International Court, for example. Legally speaking, they've also been cut off from a whole host of other international institutions as well, although access severely limited. So legally, Russia is in a very weak spot here, which I suppose doesn't matter in a way. Because one of the things you have to remember about international law is that it works on the basis that nation states consent to it. So Russia is now in a place where it simply picks which international law it wishes to consent to comply with. The rest of the world doesn't agree with that, but they cannot enforce it. They cannot really make Russia comply with international law. So what then happened is that the international community simply shuts Russia off, which of course is what it's doing anyway. So not only will that be in an economic and political sense, but in a legal sense, Russia is going to start to find itself being shut off from the rest of the world. And environmentally speaking, again, things are not looking good for Russia, but then Russia never had a good track record on environmental anyway, so that doesn't actually change very much. So the conclusion to this sort of PESTLE analysis is not exactly a good one for Russia. There's a whole host of problems coming their way. And for any foreign minister trying to tackle each and one of those issues, options are going to be somewhat limited, perhaps. So what friends does Russia have? And that's the thing you have to remember about all nation states. It doesn't matter how big and powerful they are, they need friends. That is how the international community works. It was constructed that way, deliberately so, because that was seen as a mechanism by which you could reduce wars, you could reduce conflict. Everybody had to work together, and they created a scenario of increased mutual dependency, or otherwise known as globalization. So no one is immune from it anymore. I mean, I suppose if you are some small Pacific state somewhere, maybe, then you can be immune to it. It doesn't matter. You're not important on the world stage, and therefore you don't need to be friendly, or you can be very limited in your friends. But when you're a big country, and pick any country you wish to name that you describe as big, then you must have access to the international market. The only semi-big country that doesn't is countries like North Korea. And we can see the repercussions for that. North Korea is not a big player, is not influential, and has very limited friends. So that gives them very limited options in pretty much anything. And that is why they have pretty much limited agricultural and economic prospects. So apart from North Korea, what friend can Russia call upon to help them? On top of the list, of course, is China. China is a massive economic powerhouse, and yes, China is militarily is certainly not anything to be sniffed at, but in the context of Russia, I'm not too sure whether that's very applicable. So China's benefit to Russia really comes on the economic and technological side of things. And that means that what Russia needs to be able to do are two things, or what they might need from China are two things. One is economic stimulus, and they can do that by selling oil and gas to China, and in exchange China can sell goods or technology back to Russia. The other thing they need from China is political support, particularly in the UN International Convention, because China, of course, still has access to those. But here's the thing. You've got to ask yourself the question, is it in China's interest to do that for Russia? And I think we're detecting quite a high degree of ambivalence from China. China, politically speaking, is perhaps quite aligned with Russia. Not fully, but quite aligned. And of course, China can see economic opportunities in being able to buy oil and gas at cheaper prices and sell their goods, to a desperate Russian market. But the Russian market is not big. And China knows this. And China knows that to increase Chinese influence and power and to grow the economy, the Russian market is not going to help them. It's too small. The European, the US, the Latin American, maybe even in the future, African market, are all areas of considerable more interest and more important to China. Because for China to become a global superpower, those are the markets that China needs to be able to influence, to control, and to obtain wealth from. Russia did not fit in that pattern. Russia had very little to offer. So unless China is going to go into some kind of ideological or military pact with Russia to defy the world, there isn't really a lot to be gained from being too friendly with Russia. And the Chinese leadership know this. There's a lot to risk. So what about India? Well, India has always wanted to go its own way, to be seen as a more of an independent nation. And India has been quite ambivalent as well with Russia. They've not condemned in any strong terms Russian aggression in Ukraine, but they've also not supported them either. So India is reliant upon Russia for various goods, particularly military imports. But I think India, like China, is also going to realise that Russia is not a useful ally. Russia is more of a millstone to India than a benefit. So again, like China, I imagine India is going to be trying to steer a more neutral course rather than favouring one side or another. So let's head to the other areas where there could be benefit. Let's think about the Middle East in general. So think of some of those states like UAE or Iran and Saudi Arabia and how they view Russia. Now they're certainly not as hostile to Russia as Western nations are. And maybe again they see opportunities here. But they also, like all the other nations, see threats, particularly when trying to deal with countries like the US, who will take a very dim view of political alignment with Russia. For Iran, that won't matter too much. The US hates Iran anyway, so no particular difference. But for countries like Qatar, UAE and Saudi, who want to be able to exert more influence, they know that they are very much dependent on the petrodollar to help them in that goal. So they've got to be very careful in what they do now. So again, they may be neutral with Russia. I don't see them as being overly friendly. And of course we have the final category of countries, like Syria and Kazakhstan and Belarus. These of course are very closely aligned states, or perhaps even dependent on Russia, almost vassal states you might say. And they will support Russia in whatever way that they can, whether militarily or economics and so on. But here's the reality, they don't matter. So the best friend that Russia can call upon are these smaller, marginalised countries that, in the world stage, don't matter that much. They might have certain unique benefits, whether that be oil or gas or other things, but they are not massive economic powerhouses or, huge military superpowers or anything like that. So their utility to Russia is actually quite limited. So what options does Russia really have here? Again, think you're the foreign minister. You want to pull Russia back into the international community so Russia can grow again, become strong, spend more money on its military, gain some economic growth, whatever that might be. How are you going to negotiate that? What are your strategic options for improving Russia's situation after a period of low, shall we say? Well, the options are sort of limited. One option, which is definitely the option that Russia currently is on, is to become a very insular state, the North Korean model, shall we say. And this is where hardly anyone wants to deal with Russia. And even when they do so on very specific and limited conditions. So what does that mean? That does mean that growth-wise, Russia is just going to fall further and further behind. Culturally, they will be becoming more disaligned with the rest of the world. They will have less access to technologies. They will keep falling behind. Their economic output will be terrible. So this is an option that perhaps looks appealing to a regime like Putin, but it is an option that it spirals downwards. It doesn't improve their situation. It only improves perhaps their ability to control the country and pretty much nothing else. And part of the reason for this as well is because the Western nations have recognized that the only way that Russia could really influence them was through money, particularly through the oligarchs. And those avenues and that influence have been severely cut back at this point in time. So Russia is not really able to exert influence. There's only two ways that Russia can exert influence on the world and its neighbours. One is to go crazy and threaten nuclear war, which let's just say that's not going to be a beneficial outcome for Russia, so we'll discount that. And the other one is through oil and gas. And the reality is that threat, for oil and gas, is going to become less and less over time. And we can already see that both the US and the EU are making very serious steps to disengage themselves from Russian oil and gas. It may take them some years, but those are steps that they are determined to take. So that means more marginalisation for Russia. So what that does mean is that Russia needs to build alternative alliances. Now, of course, you've got North Korea, you've got China. And China perhaps is going to be the most useful partner that Russia has, particularly if China buys all that Russian oil and gas. And India sort of falls into this category as well. But their ability to help Russia is somewhat limited. Economically, there are certain benefits, but there are countries that need to export more than they need to import. And Russia is now in a state where it needs to export rather than import. Import, or a huge quantity of import from India and China, can help Russia in the short term, but long term wise, economically speaking, that continues the downward spiral. So Russia needs to find other ways to grow internationally. Well, they can't really export oil and gas to the Middle East, so that's not going to help. Perhaps they can export military goods. That has been traditionally a strong export area for Russia. But I perhaps might venture that in view of how poorly Russian equipment has performed in Ukraine, that particular market may well start to slow down quite a bit in the near future. So really all Russia can become is perhaps the cheap exporter of military goods or oil and gas to perhaps Africa or South Asia and so on. And that might help a little bit. That might create a small form of alternative alliance network. But it's not exactly going to set the world alight. It's not going to make Russia a global superpower. So there's one further option that Russia really has to get out of this awful hole. And that is to align itself, or even to make itself subservient to a bigger power. And there's not many of them. We can rule out the EU, I think. We can certainly rule out the US. And I don't think India is going to really feature in this category. So that just leaves China. And I think the projection at this point, if Putin wishes to halt that huge downward spiral that is the Russian economy, he's going to have to place it under the protection of China, as it were, which is an interesting change in the relationship. I don't know how China is going to view that. Does China really want something as big, as cumbersome, and as troublesome as Russia hanging on to their coattails, as it were? So this is going to be the interesting strategic decision that China is going to make. Is that, do they want Russia as a bit of a sort of subservient state? And is Putin willing to do that to maintain his power, or is he going to maintain his power by doing a bit of a North Korea? So what sort of conclusion can I draw as a negotiator? Well, quite simply, I wouldn't want to be Russian. I honestly, looking at their prospects, whether that's economic, whether that's political, I just cannot see any upside. I cannot see how in the next few years Russia is going to be anything other than in a terrible state. The Western nations will ensure that. And even the countries that might be neutral or semi-aligned with Russia are going to be extremely nervous about going too far because of the fear of secondary sanctions or other repercussions. So prospect-wise, if you're a negotiator in Russia, then I pity you, because you really aren't going to have much of a good time in the next few years. So I hope you found that interesting. I look forward to seeing the comments in the comments section below. And of course, if anyone has any other particular angles or any other topics that they would like me to talk about as a negotiator, then please do put so in the comment section and let me know.